Audio check. Everyone can hear me fine? Oh, okay. Now we're recording. Yep. Okay. Thank you very much to all the CHBA members that are joining us today. We've actually previously delivered a very similar presentation of what you're going to see to a number of different groups: the BC Ministry of Energy Mines Low Carbon Innovation, Northwest Gas Association, Natural Resources Canada, Electricity Canada, and the CHBA itself. So I hope you find it illuminating. David, if you want to flip to the next slide, please. There we go. So who is FortisBC? Of course, everyone's familiar with BC Hydro as the primary electricity provider in the province. I like to see that FortisBC Electric is the other electric utility in BC. Our service area is much smaller and is confined to the southern interior part of the province. It's the green and the yellow areas shown on the map on the page. Basically, the Okanagan, Similkameen, Boundary, and West Kootenay regions. The slide is a little old. We now have about 190,000 direct and indirect electric customers compared to BC Hydro's roughly 2 million customers or so. And then, of course, there's the roughly 1.1 million gas customers that we serve. So if you're outside the Okanagan or the West Kootenay, then the gas company is more likely the FortisBC that you're familiar with. If you're in the Okanagan, you're probably getting a bill from both. Interestingly enough, on a direct energy comparison basis, FortisBC, when you combine both the gas and electric, we're the single largest energy provider in BC. So even though we have less customers in total, when you combine those two divisions, we deliver quite a bit more energy actually than BC Hydro. And we'll show you some numbers to demonstrate that coming up. But it's a key point for our discussion today that when we look at the potential impacts of switching that gas load over to the electric system. Okay, so next slide, David. I'm not going to dwell overly on this slide, but just for context of the various audiences, we wanted to include a list of the many studies that FortisBC has been working on to support decarbonization, and primarily of our gas delivery system. Our electricity system is primarily hydro, just like BC Hydro. We have our own hydro plants over in the West Kootenay, and we also purchase electricity from BC Hydro. But clearly the decarbonization discussion is important to us as a company overall. And we've worked to that end with many external experts to help inform our plans and strategic directions. So universities, expert consultants, you name it. But that last item, the Electrify Kelowna study, is effectively what we're presenting to you today. And next slide. So conveniently, FortisBC is both the gas and electricity supplier for the Kelowna area. And that gives us a unique insight into energy use by the customers in Kelowna. If you're not familiar with the town, city, it's about a 4-hour drive northeast of Vancouver, in southern interior BC. Not a huge city, but with a population of just under 150,000, it's still the largest urban area in the BC interior. And all the electricity used in Kelowna comes in over 3 230,000 volt or 230 kilovolt transmission lines. 2 from the north on this map and 1 from the south. Those are the red lines, basically. Similarly, the gas arrives via 2 12-inch pipelines. Again, 1 from the north and 1 from the south. Those are the purple lines on the map. You'll see there's a red line that goes to the right and a purple line that goes to the left. Those don't actually connect anywhere. They're just supplying other customers. So north-south is pretty much it. All of that infrastructure is owned, planned, and operated by FortisBC. And so it makes a nice ring-fenced microcosm to study when it comes to the delivery and use of energy in the area. But before we go further, as I have at the bottom of the slide, I want to explore and reinforce 2 very important concepts: energy versus demand. And for either a gas or electric utility, energy is the amount of the commodity, whether it's electricity or gas, that you deliver to customers over a period of time. And if you look on your bill, you see that it's what's measured in kilowatt hours for electricity or gigajoules for gas. And for most forecasting purposes, we actually do consider the energy needs of our customers over a full year, a period of time. But an equally important, or actually much more important consideration when it comes to infrastructure planning is peak demand. And that's the amount of electricity that's consumed, demanded by our customers during the peak hour on that coldest winter day. And it's measured in watts. It's an instantaneous measurement, or in our case, millions of watts, megawatts. So again, electricity or energy is electricity or gas used over time, and demand, sometimes called capacity, is essentially an instantaneous or point in time measurement. Okay, keep those in the back of your mind. Because on the next slide, David, we've provided some actual consumption information for the Kelowna area from 2020. It's a typical year. And to make the gas to electric comparison easier, we've also done the conversions to convert gas, which we typically measure in petajoules, PJs, to electricity, which is measured in megawatts and gigawatt hours. Now, I'm not going to go through all the numbers of the slide, but if you look in the total area, an observation that I'd make is that even though we have only 2/3 the number of gas customers compared to electric, so roughly 44,000 gas customers to 76,000 electric, collectively, if you look in the lines below, collectively those gas customers use more peak and annual energy than our electric customers. And in decarbonization discussions, a lot of time the conversation tends to focus on annual energy use. For example, can we replace the energy provided by conventional methane, natural gas, in any given year with electricity from greener sources, maybe wind or solar or hydro, geothermal, what have you? But what's almost always forgotten or ignored in that conversation is the infrastructure needed to meet the utility's peak demand. And in BC, and in fact for most of Canada, those electric system peaks occur during our temperature extremes. In the summer, due to air conditioning load, or more importantly, the winter, on those cold, dark winter evenings, almost always between about 5 and 6 p.m. And that's a much more challenging discussion, and it's the focus of our presentation today. Next slide, please. Okay, so with that context, I'll turn it over to David now. Sorry, lost in my notes here. And yeah, so David, go ahead and show us how your model works.
We've done this before.
Yes, we have.
All right, thanks, Paul. So internally, I was fooling around with some data here, and what I'm going to do first is just explain what we're going to see in the model. It'll help a little bit when we start manipulating the model. The model is running live, runs in a browser, so we will be actually using it live today. It's not a bunch of screenshots. But anyway, I'll set this up. So what we have on screen here is a thing that we at Fortis call a scatter plot. And you're looking at 3 years worth of data ending in 2020. So if you counted them, you'd count a little over 1,000 dots on the screen. And this is the peak gas usage for each day of the year for 3 years, plotted against the average daily temperature. And so we notice a couple things. First of all, at the right-hand side, at temperatures about 15 degrees Celsius and warmer, that the dots really flatten out. And that is representative of the hot water load or load that isn't used for space heating. But as soon as it gets colder than 15 degrees, the dots climb up the page very consistently. Every time it gets a little bit colder, our customers use a little bit more gas all the way out to minus 15 degrees, which was the coldest temperature recorded in the 3 years worth of data shown here. So over time, and kind of the essence of this model is to manipulate these dots to play kind of what if. And so over time, these dots could shift up the page. So at any given temperature, the dots could be higher if customers or the population of Kelowna increased. But they could also shift down the page at any given temperature if customers in Kelowna improved the building envelope, for example, right? If they put in more insulation or replace doors, windows, et cetera, then at any given temperature, you'd expect these dots to shift down the page. What we'll be doing today is manipulating a chart that looks a lot like this, and the dots will be shifting up and down the page, and we'll see what happens when we make different assumptions about the future. Now, the other thing I should mention here is that when we get these dots, we fit a line through the middle of them, or the software does. I don't do it, the software does it. The question is then, well, how far out should we stretch the line? Because, well, this dot here was the coldest temperature we recorded in those 3 years. It's certainly not the coldest temperature that we could experience. So what we do is we establish a design temperature using Environment Canada weather data, and we design to that design temperature. And in this case, it's out at point number 2. Now, for Kelowna, that design temperature is about minus 26 degrees. And so every time we do this, regardless of where the dots end, we stretch the line out until it hits minus 26. Of note is that on December 22nd, 2022, we recorded a minus 26.2 degrees in Kelowna. So it happens once every 20 to 25 years, but that is what we have to design for. We have to assume that in any given winter, we're going to get an event like that, a polar vortex, and that we're going to have to design our system to provide electricity to customers when it's that cold. So then the other thing I can do, of course, is I can add on the electric system. And this is, as Paul said, the convenient part about doing this in Kelowna is that we have the gold dots and we have the blue dots. But of course, the first thing you notice with the blue dots is there's 2 peaks, one in the summer for air conditioning, one in the winter for heating. It's less, significantly less, as Paul said, we deliver more gas energy than we do electric energy, but we do stretch it out to the same design temperature in the winter, and we don't see the flattening in the summer. So on colder days, most of the energy comes from the gas system. When we look at this kind of stuff, and what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be trying to convert the gas load into electricity, right? So it's called Electrify Kelowna. So that'll be the idea. One of the things that will be critical to this whole piece is the role of heat pumps in that conversion. So the idea that heat pumps are more efficient than a gas furnace. So if we convert gas heating load into electricity, then the heat pumps ought to play a significant role. So we, as Fortis, contracted a field study of our customers by a consulting company, and they went and looked at, I think it was 24 or something like that, 25 of our customers that had a heat pump installed, and they put all kinds of sensors on them, and they did a report for us. So in that report, the heat pumps were grouped into 3 broad categories, and you'll see in a minute that those are modeled in the application, so we can see what would happen if there was widespread adoption of low performing, mid performing, and high performing heat pumps. We presented this to some audiences, and one of them said, hey, yeah, but we're going to be looking 20 years out today. Heat pumps 20 years from now will probably be better than the ones that are available today. So we've actually included some hypothetical heat pumps in here about maybe what will happen in the future. Critical thing to keep in mind about heat pumps is that in warmer weather, so closer to 15 degrees or so, they perform better. And they have a thing called the coefficient of performance, and that coefficient of performance changes with temperature. So as it gets colder, they become slightly less efficient, and that's also a critical thing that we'll see in the model today. More importantly is that none of the installed heat pumps right now in the Kelowna area that our consultant looked at were able to provide efficiencies or heat more efficiently than a baseboard heater at the design temperature. So by the time we get to the design temperature, those heat pumps are basically operating as baseboard heaters. So anyways, we have this interactive software application. It's got this awful name called Slider Tool, but I can't help that. That's just the nickname it got. And we are now going to jump over to it, hopefully here. Is that all visible to everybody?
Yep, it's there, David.
That's good. So here it is, and I'm going to just talk about a couple things on here. First, you see a bunch of red lines. So these are the vertical ones ought to be obvious. These are those design temperatures I spoke about. So that's going to be kind of the goalpost there. We're going to fit everything inside of that. But there's a horizontal line here that's new, and this horizontal line is the capacity limit for the Kelowna area right now. So this is the limit of what we can deliver into Kelowna. So when I turn on the gas dots and the electric dots, that ought to look familiar. That's the same stuff that created the slide. So the gold is the gas, the blue is the electric. And if I turn on the forecast model, then we'll get those lines through there and they'll stretch out until they hit these vertical lines here. So the objective of today's exercise is to see if we can convert this gas load, these gold dots, into blue. We want to take all the energy that's contained here and we want to move it over to the electric system. But when we do that, the constraint is we don't want to go above this red dashed line. As Paul will explain in a minute, if we do exceed this line, there are some seriously significant cost implications for us as a utility. So it's critical that we do whatever we can, whatever solutions we come up with have to respect the tip of this line, not crossing this threshold. As I said, right now, this is the data as of 2020, but we're going to be looking out 20 years. We don't need to model it for today. What we do need to look at is what's going to happen 20 years from now. As I said, when we change these sliders, it'll manipulate these dots up or down the page. So in 20 years, more people will live in Kelowna, presumably. So when I click on this slider at 20 years, what we'll see happen is these dots will slide up the page and the lines will get refitted and the numbers will change. So here we go. I click on that, everything shifts up the page a little bit and these numbers go up. So now it says at the bottom here, Kelowna 2040, and this is what we expect things to look like in 2040. So that's that. Well, there's 4 tabs across the top here that we're going to explore. The second one is much simpler. It's just electrification. And this is the heart of the model. This is Electrify Kelowna. This is where we convert the gold dots into blue. In other words, Electrify Kelowna, 10% at a time, all the way over to 100%. Now I could slide these in 10% increments and explain each way, but I put a little button on here that looks like a VCR thing. And if I hit the play button, it'll jump through this 10% at a time, and you'll see the gold dots come down the page and the blue dots go up the page. So without further ado, here we go. I click on the button and we go in 10% increments. So the model is recalculating each time here based on a bunch of internal calculations and assumptions. But you can see what happens now, right? We get to 50% now. The gold dots are coming down the page. The blue dots are going up. Obviously, we've now surpassed that capacity limit. So by the time we get to 100%, the gas system now is providing no energy. So our greenhouse gases emissions are 0. They've gone right to 0. There's no gas used anymore. All of the energy that the gas system was delivering is now shifted over to the electric grid. Unfortunately, our peak is now 1,400 megawatts. So we blew through the 550 megawatt limit. And this right now, if we left it like this, would represent some significant cost. Paul will go over in a minute, but measured in billions just for the residents of Kelowna. Now, when I converted this load over, the first basic assumption is that all the gas furnaces get pulled out, gas connections are turned off, and the hot water and the furnaces are replaced with electric equivalents. In this case, all baseboard heaters. So this is the starting point, and we know, as I said in the preamble there, that this isn't what's going to happen. People are going to put in heat pumps, and that ought to help us with this curve. So, as I said, we have data from our field study about what happens to this load when we replace those baseboard heaters with heat pumps. As I said, the consultant grouped the field study into 3 broad groups. So we start off at the low end with the mini splits. And when I turn this on, you'll have to watch quite carefully. When I click on this button, these mini splits, and again, it says assumes 100% adoption. So this means that in 20 years, every single home in Kelowna has a mini split. You'll see these dots down in this lower area here shift downward. So here we go. When I turn that on, you'll see this line bend. But at about 0 degrees Celsius, this mini split stops providing any benefit other than what you would get from a baseboard heater. So at this point, there's a kink. And then from that point out, there's no impact. So Fortis is still on the hook for 1,400 megawatts, even though everybody's put in a mini split. So it helps them because as this line bends down, that represents energy savings to the consumer. So that's good. But unfortunately for the utility, we need to still plan for that very cold day. But what happens if we go to the mid-level and the high-level ones? These are ducted systems. So what we see here is a much bigger bend, and it goes out much further. So these ones perform much better, right out to about minus 18 degrees is good. So again, a big savings for consumers here. We look at the none versus the mid. So the more this line bends down, the more energy we save. Again, Fortis is on the hook to provide the 1,400. So there's going to be a few days in the year represented by this line segment here where we exceed the capability. But what if we go to the highest performing ones? Well, the highest performing ones do a little bit better, but the ones that in the field study that we conducted still stopped at about minus 18 degrees. So we're left with a situation where if everybody put in the best heat pump available today, Fortis is still on the hook for the 1400. Now, I said one of the audiences said, yeah, but what about future ones? So I have some future ones modeled in here, and I colored them red just to remind us that these don't exist yet. So this is future technology. But if we look at 400%, at 400%, right, we're getting very close now to having some success. And finally, at 500%, it finally starts to knock that peak down. So these ones perform and are able to provide useful heat beyond the minus 26 degrees threshold. At 600%, even better. But when we get to 600%, the observation I have is that this assumes that in 20 years, 100% of the residents of Kelowna will install a heat pump that is fully 250% more efficient than the best ones available today. And even at that, we still blow through this limit by a full 300 megawatts. So it's kind of a sobering thought there. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Paul just to discuss some of the numbers behind this. See if this goes back here. Yes. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, David. So we'll come back to the model again in a bit, because I'm sure you have some questions about, what are some other adjustments we made. There are things that we can play with, so we'll look at that. But if nothing else changes, if right now, if we exceed that 550 megawatt limit, what happens? So we've shown on this slide a summary of the results for various scenarios, right? 25, 50, 75, 100% electric load switching. The red ones are basically intended to imply that those are when you're exceeding that 550 megawatt limit. As he mentioned, that's the ultimate capacity for the Kelowna area electric system, and it's based on essentially the poles and the wires and the substations that are in place today, and how much power you can instantaneously deliver through them to customers in the area. It does allow for some amount of reasonable expansion as well, but you very quickly hit a point where to expand the system beyond that, you need significant reinforcements, and I'll talk about that in a second. For some context, though, for comparison, currently for Kelowna, the record winter peak demand for Kelowna is about 370 megawatts. And that occurred on that date that David mentioned, December 22nd, 2022. So that's the winter, 370. For comparison, our summer record peak is actually slightly higher. It's 385 megawatts. So this area of our system is actually now what we call dual peaking, or even slightly into the summer peaking range. But again, from a gas perspective, we don't worry too much about that. Regardless, based on the 20-year forecast in our recently accepted long-term electric resource plan, which we filed with our regulator, and they've accepted it, we don't expect to reach that 550 megawatt limit in Kelowna for about 40 years, based on typical growth patterns. Okay, so if there's a question of, well, perhaps the system hasn't been sized appropriately. Well, no, it is sized appropriately for our current load growth rates. However, if there's a massive shift from the gas energy delivery over to the electric system, then we're in uncharted territory. And if we look at that demand or capacity gap between where our load is today and where it would take to get to even 75% electrification. So on the bottom line, we're going from 476 to 1279, almost 1,000 megawatts. That capacity gap is almost the size of the BC Hydro Site C facility, dedicated just to supply Kelowna. And of course, that's only the generation part of the need, the Site C. On the next slide, David. One thing to keep in mind is there's effectively no electricity generation facilities in the Okanagan. There's a handful of very small, but almost all of the power, 99.5% of it, is wheeled, as we call it, into the area over BC Hydro's transmission system. They're 500 kV and 230 kilovolt systems that transmit the power to us, and then we deliver it within the Okanagan. And just for some historical and cost context, on this slide, I've listed a couple of the major transmission projects we've constructed in the Okanagan over recent years to get us to the electrical capacity we have today. And if you look on that right-hand line, it's about $150 million in as-spent dollars over the last 30 years or so. Okay. Once we exceed the 550 megawatt limit, though, those 230 kilovolt transmission lines I mentioned at the start and the substations that they supply will no longer be sufficient. And to meet that increased demand, we'll either have to build a new large generation resource that's firm and dependable, so not solar or wind, because you can't count on them producing power when you need to, and it would need to be located right in Kelowna. Or we'd need to build very significant and costly new transmission infrastructure. And likely that would mean new 500 kilovolt transmission lines from BC Hydro's bulk electric system directly into the Kelowna area. And that's what I'm showing on the right hand of the slide here is a typical 500 kilovolt transmission line through a new greenfield right of way from somewhere in the northern part of the Okanagan to somewhere down in the southern part of the Okanagan. So about 200 kilometers of greenfield virgin right of way. On the next slide, David, within the city itself, we would need to build new transmission lines, feeders, and substations to meet that load. And so we provided a list of the expected projects here. We've sat down and looked at where that load would transition in Kelowna, what the existing infrastructure is, what the existing capacity of it is, and what it would need to be. I think anyone who's built new infrastructure in years knows all about the impacts those projects cause. There's the increased capital investment will put pressure on rates paid by our electric customers. And the construction of new lines and substations impacts the environment, the public, and Indigenous groups. And note the cost of the substations and power lines. It's the bottom line in this table. It basically starts at around $1 billion and it goes up from there. And if you add the power generation, because the power has to come from somewhere, and the lands costs that go along with it, which is noted at the bottom, neither of those are included in these. Based on our estimates, it could be several $1 billion more. For comparison purposes, the current regulated rate base of the entire FortisBC electric utility, so our generation, transmission, fleet, facilities, you name it, is about $1.6 billion today. So we're talking about a doubling or more of the investment in electric infrastructure to meet this kind of peak demand. And that's just for Kelowna. Presumably something would be happening similar elsewhere in our system and the rest of the province that would be driving this. Next slide, David. Of course, that raises two natural questions then. Well, okay, what can we do about the problem? And are there feasible and plausible scenarios that will allow our peak demand to remain below that 550 megawatt limit while reducing the use of conventional methane and hence GHG emissions? So I'll turn it back to David and we'll explore some more scenarios here.
All right, thanks, Paul. So as Paul said, we can't leave it like this. We've got to do what are the solutions? What are the things we can do to bring this tip down below this line? Understanding now that this line really represents $2 to $3 billion of investment for a fairly small customer base. So there's another tab here, and this one is pretty complicated, but this is where the application, I guess, gets its name. All of these sliders manipulate these dots, so we can fool around with some of these to see what we can do to see what it's sensitive to try and bring this down. So I'm going to skip a bunch of the top here. The first one of interest really is this one called gas residential use rate. And really this is a measure of the average building envelope in the city of Kelowna. So right now the average customer in Kelowna uses 71 gigajoules of gas, and that reflects their building envelope. Customers on Vancouver Island use about 51, so quite a bit less, obviously a warmer climate. But what if the residents in Kelowna, really stepped up? We had DSM programs to improve the insulation. What if we drove this number down to 36, cut it in half? So you can see right away what happens, right? As we make the buildings better, they use less energy and this peak comes down. So that's a pretty good hit. It brought it down quite a bit. We're still above the line, but it certainly helped. We have conservation and demand side management programs, rebates. But right now they're kind of focused on annual energy and not capacity. But what if we changed our programs? What if we made them, 10 times better and incentivize people to reduce their peak demand? What if we pushed this out? And you can see that one doesn't move the needle very much at all. Helps, but doesn't really get us where we need to go. When we did this, we said, well, this is 2040. By 2040, the zero emission vehicle legislation will be in full swing from the provincial government. You won't be able to buy a gas powered car. So we put an allowance in here for electric vehicle charging, but during the peak hour. So we would incentivize and educate customers not to charge their car at 5 o'clock at night in December when we're trying to use the energy to heat the homes and for cooking and whatnot. But we expect some people will have to because they need the vehicle or whatever. And so we have allowed 75 megawatts for that in all of these blue dots. But what if we put time of use rates in there that were so significant and so expensive that it incentivized people to not charge their car at 5 o'clock in December? What if we pushed this down to 15? And what you see happen here is all of the dots come down, winter and summer, but it still leaves us at a double where we need to be. There's one slider left here at the bottom called renewable natural gas. And this one's interesting because basically what we did is we converted the gold dots into blue, right? So the greenhouse gases went to zero, but now the blue dots are too high. But what if we converted the blue dots into green, which would be renewable natural gas, which is, GHG neutral? So what if I brought on renewable natural gas and replaced the electricity with RNG? So suppose we went to 20%. So now it has a pretty big impact. So now we're delivering this much RNG into Kelowna, and now this peak is starting to come down. What if I went to 50%? And by this point, you can see that this is going to provide a solution. When we get to 75%, we're finally there. So if we were able to replace 75% of the conventional gas with RNG, we would be able to keep the electric peak below the threshold with a few other sliders. These are not unreasonable positions, and that would provide a solution. Now there is one other way. I'm gonna reset these sliders back down because there's one other solution we can look at here. I was going to put these back where they were, most of them. I'll leave the building envelope one where it is. When we were on the heat pump tab, we were looking at these heat pumps that are installed today, but there was a checkbox down here for hybrid heat pumps. And we didn't play with that one. I'm going to turn these on now. So a hybrid heat pump is a heat pump that is a gas backup furnace of some type in it, and the gas portion can be used in colder weather. So when I click on this and turn this on, the chart is going to get a bit messy, I'll tell you right now. And so what we'll see happen is the dots are going to go away and we're just going to be left with the lines, but the dots are there. It's just too messy to show them. So here we go. When I turn this on, we see the same lines as we saw before. The hybrid heat pumps have this concept of a cutover temperature. In other words, the temperature at which they cut over from operating in electric mode to operating in gas mode. So I'm going to pull this slider way down to 6 degrees Celsius. And right away, we see what happens is those heat pumps work until it gets to be 6 degrees. At 6 degrees, the electric portion of the heat pump shuts off. This curving line here is the base load, right? Lighting, TVs, iPad chargers, all that stuff. And now the heating load is picked up by the gas system. But now this peak here is well below our threshold. So what if we cut these over and understand that the longer this line is, the more days you're going to use gas, and therefore the more gas you're going to use. But if I start sliding this slider to the left, we see the lines creep over to the left. The further left we go, the less gas we use, the less GHGs we emit, and we get just to a point where that blue line touches the red dashed line, and we have a solution here. So this is the electric heat pumps working until -3 degrees. At that point, the heating load is transitioned over to the gas portion of the heat pump. And this represents 30 to 40 days in the winter right here, this part of the curve. The cool part is, though, that now we have a bunch of tools in the toolbox, right? We can go back here to these other drivers and we can say, well, hey, let's go back and reduce that EV charging. And down comes the curve. Now we can go back to the heat pumps and say, well, we want to push this gold line as far left as possible. So let's go to -5. Well, that worked. How about -6? So over time, as the technology improves and as things change, we have now a bunch of different things that we can use to keep this peak below the red dashed line. The critical point, though, is that on those very cold days, the gas system is used to pick up this heating load. Of course, part of this gas system can be RNG, so we could put on 15% RNG, and again, you see what happens. The RNG comes up here, the conventional gas drops, and now, again, we're below the line. We can push that thing over even further. And over time, we're going to get to a point as the technology improves, as more RNG comes on, that we push this further and further to the left, reducing the GHGs from conventional gas every step of the way. So I'm going to pass it back to Paul to wrap it up.
Yeah, perfect, David. And yeah, I think the key point that David makes here is that really what we want to offer, and I think what's desirable, is to have multiple levers to pull. You don't want to be reliant on any one solution to get us where we need to be on emissions reductions. If we put all our eggs in one basket, that might leave us in a bad scenario. So we've listed a couple things on this slide, but I'll just summarize them thus, which is one thing that we haven't really talked about, but a great way to reduce emissions in the province, of course, is on the transportation side. Maximizing the conversion of passenger vehicles to electric vehicles is a great way to reduce provincial emissions. And you can also, as David demonstrated, if you can incent people to charge in the off-peak hours without adding to the peak load, that works out and it benefits everyone, because by selling more energy through the utility, it actually reduces rates for everyone. As long as you don't have to add infrastructure, as long as you can deliver more energy, that has a rate reduction impact. So that's the first one. The second key point, I think, is obviously continuing to leverage the gas infrastructure. And what we're suggesting is employing hybrid heating solutions to complement heat pumps and reduce the need for unnecessary investment in electric infrastructure to meet peak demands that last for a very short period of time. And further, you can pair those hybrid heating solutions with the increased use of renewable gases. So the carbon intensity of the times when your gas furnace is running and your heat pump is off, you're still not emitting renewable gas, or you're still not emitting GHGs. So really with that, I think we'll conclude and say what we've presented today really is intended to demonstrate how at FortisBC we feel that the best way to meet our customers' needs, and by best, what I mean is it's the safest, it's most reliable, most resilient by having two energy delivery systems, and most importantly, the most cost-effective way to reduce GHG emissions is to use both the electric and the gas systems together going forward. And with that, I'm sure you have lots of thoughts and questions, and we'd be happy to hear them. It looks like, yeah, we're good for time. We still have about 20 minutes, so fire away. I don't see anything in the Q&A at this point. So if you want to ask questions verbally, I think, Terry, if that works as well. Raise your hand.
Hi. Yeah, I think yeah, they could still use the Q&A or the raise hand function. We would have to give them permission to speak from a controller perspective, so that probably won't work. But I really encourage folks to, if there's any questions or thoughts, just pop it in that Q&A function. It's down at the bottom of your screen, and there's no such thing as a crazy question. I see.
I can't believe that. I can't believe that no one has any thoughts on what we presented here. I'm sure some of the statements are provocative, needless to say. So feel free to challenge us. We'll do the best we can to answer them.
Okay, guys and gals, you heard it here first. They welcome any challenges. So now's your time. I know this is a great conversation around advocacy tables, board tables throughout all of our CHBA locals. It's a huge issue. Oh, we've got one. There we go. Challenge accepted.
So given this, what is the proposed new rates we could face without the flexibility? So that's an interesting question. And I'm assuming with that question, what you're referring to is some of those earlier scenarios where if we didn't rely on, say, the hybrid solutions and so on, if we did go in for, I'll say the all electrification solution and chose to invest in the system. So in our long-term gas resource plan, we filed the Kelowna study as evidence in there. And as part of that, one of the questions that we received from our commission and interveners was, well, what would the rate impacts be for electric customers? I don't remember the exact numbers offhand, but they are on the public record in that study. But as I recall, it was somewhere in the range of 120 to 140% of current rates. So for example, if you're paying 14 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity now, to support this level of capital investment, rates would go up to around 30 or 30 plus cents per kilowatt hour. So it will be a significant increase. Yeah, well, I'm not sure I can answer that question. Why is the new code so adamant about eliminating gas? I'll give you my own personal opinion there. I guess this isn't necessarily what the company would subscribe to. So this is Paul speaking, but I guess there's a belief that by reducing the use of gas, it reduces GHG emissions. And we all look for simple solutions. So one easy way to reduce emissions is just to reduce gas. But if you don't look at all the implications of what that translates into, that can lead you down a bad path, I guess is what I'm getting at. So, but you'd have to ask the policymakers that question. I think that various city governments are curtailing natural gas use in appliances, and this seems short-sighted if there are hybrid. I was actually thinking about that last night, and I know it's a bit of a crazy scenario, but you could find, and this is again Paul speculating, you could actually find yourself in a future where, say, municipalities stop the use of gas in their areas, new customers can't connect to gas, and over time, gas customers drop off the system, but eventually we will start seeing that impact then on the electric system, right? The rebound effect could be, well, okay, at that point, then they'll allow the installation of hybrids. And ultimately, a hybrid is just a furnace paired with a heat pump along with a smart controller. So it could actually be retrofitted in the future. It doesn't necessarily preclude the use of hybrids in the future, but it's certainly suboptimal, I guess is the way I put it. How can we help bring this issue up? That's exactly why we do these presentations, is we're trying to share a message. And I guess anything that you can do in terms of talking to your constituents, just to share that there are implications if we make decisions without understanding the full picture, right? That we can't just shift from one energy source to another energy source without there being an impact there. One thing I will actually add in here in the model, when I look at one very common question actually that we've had in previous presentations is, your model doesn't calculate net GHG emissions. Absolutely, that's improvement that David is busily working on for Electrify Kelowna version 2, or the slider tool version 2, because you can see here, so for example, in the version that's on your screen, there is electricity use, which in BC has a very low carbon intensity. It does have some, but it does have some low carbon intensity. And there's the use of some conventional gas. So you'd be able to calculate the amount of gas. It's essentially what we refer to in mathematical terms. It's the integral under the curve, under that yellow curve. And so as you move the sliders around, you'd be able to calculate the resulting GHG emissions from that scenario. And I guess the idea I'm getting at here is you'd be able to play with those sliders and find kind of an optimal point where, okay, here's what the emissions that would be, and here's what the infrastructure costs that would go along to support that would be. So if you've been wondering about that, that is an improvement that we are already looking to implement in the next version of the tool. Okay, we got a bunch more coming in here. David, do you want to take any of these and let me?
I can't see them without,
you can't?
well, I'm sharing my screen.
Oh, that's right. Okay, never mind that. Okay. Okay, cities in the Lower Mainland does not allow new gas connections. How would an owner heat up the house to do any cooking when there is a power outage? Just to be clear, right now, based on the step code, it's not so much that you can't have new gas connections, it's that you can't use heating equipment that isn't at least 100% efficient. And right now, only, or at least 100% efficient. So interestingly, baseboard heaters count because they are 100% efficient. And electric heat pumps are more than 100% efficient most of the time, so they count. Gas furnaces, even though like myself, I have a 98% efficiency gas furnace, that doesn't, you can't install one of those if you're in the step code 4, I believe it is now in Lower Mainland. But you can still bring in gas to your house for cooking and for a fireplace if you wanted to. That those purposes are still allowed. But you do bring up an interesting point, which is again the resiliency aspect, that if you put all of your eggs in one basket for electricity, you are exposed to more risk of outages. And I challenge you to think, I know for the folks on the call that have electricity at their house and have gas at their house, and I'll ask you this question. When was the last time you had an electric outage at your house? You know, probably in the last couple of months or years. When was the last time you had an outage to your gas supply at your house? And, you know, think about that and play it back a couple of weeks ago when we were seeing temperatures in the interior here down to -30 and even down in Vancouver in the minus teens, and the resulting implications if that energy supply was lost at those very cold temperatures. Has there been any study done, like a cost benefits study, to see if people were given grants to put up solar panels? Interesting point. So solar, yes. And this kind of gets back to my comment earlier on that solar is a very good resource potentially for adding energy into your system that you can use throughout your year. The problem with solar, as we know though, is it doesn't necessarily produce electricity when you need it. And as I mentioned, and what David is depicting on his slides here in the model, we're talking about peak electricity use. And for both BC Hydro and FortisBC, if you look in our recent, the press releases that we put out after the recent cold weather spell, both utilities, we hit our peaks between 5 and 6 p.m. on whatever, well, the previous one was December 22nd. So December 22nd, I'll use between 5 and 6 p.m. And I'd ask how much solar energy is produced at that point. It's essentially, well, it's zero. There's just no sunlight. Your next question would probably be, well, yes, but can't you put batteries in to store it? You could, but you'd need a very large battery installation because it has to supply you not just through the next couple hours, but remember, cold spells typically last a couple days. You need that battery storage to last you through multiple days of energy constraints. So is that really a cost-effective solution? For summer and offsetting air conditioning load, absolutely. I think solar is a great idea. And we should definitely be looking at more. And I know BC Hydro is looking at that. And even at FortisBC, we have looked at grid scale solar too.
David, I think you can see the questions now also, is that correct?
Well, I don't know if I click on the QA thing here, maybe it'll show up.
Yeah,
You
they should
should
show up.
yeah.
And does that show up in the middle of the screen for everybody, or that's okay?
No, it looks like it's just because I can't see it. So you
Okay.
must have it. So that I talked about the home battery storage to offset usage during peak demands. That was the challenge there. Yeah, okay. Interesting question here. Is there any benefit to having gas during a power outage? If you can't power your air handler, how do you use your gas furnace? It is a fair question. I'll look at my house. So for example, I do have gas in my house. Yes, I have a gas furnace, which requires electricity. I also have a gas fireplace though. So at the very least, I can have some area of my house and it's in the basement and it actually heats fairly well. And I'm sure, many folks on the call can relate to that. So by having auxiliary heating sources, you can at least keep the house heated. Keep in mind that if you're looking at going forward, if you're looking to build a new house and you can't use a gas furnace and you can't use a gas water heater, the only things left that you might use gas for would be a cooktop. Well, you're probably going to put in an induction cooktop as well. The only thing left now is maybe a barbecue and maybe a fireplace. Would you go through the trouble of installing gas for that? Probably not. So you may not have that backup source, is the first thing. And yes, you do need electricity, but it's a whole lot less electricity to run a furnace fan than it is to run a heat pump. So worst case, if you happen to have a small portable generator, yes, they do emit emissions, but you could get away with a small Honda 1,000-watt generator powering your furnace fan. If you want to power your heat pump and electric backup heat during an outage, you're looking at a multi-1,000-watt generator to do that. So there is still definitely a benefit in having a gas furnace, even during an electricity outage.
You want me to take one?
Sure.
I feel like I should.
Now that you can see it.
You didn't talk about this one from Alan about as gas furnaces get changed out before the mandates take effect, they're being replaced with high efficient furnaces. That should also bring the gas load down. So this is an interesting one that actually works backward from the way you'd think. Yes, we did take that into account. So the model does have a slider here for furnace efficiency in the design year, currently set at 90%. The interesting thing about this, though, is that the lower the efficiency of the furnace or of the installed base of furnaces, right? So that's all the really old ones like I have. Mine's, I think, 25 years old. And the much newer ones, as those furnaces are operating at efficiencies far below their nameplate, then the heat coming from that gas usage is what the electric grid needs to replace. So actually, if we overestimate the efficiency of the installed furnaces, in other words, if they're performing worse than we think, then the amount of electricity you need is actually less. So if the furnaces are all at 99 or 98%, then you got to convert all that energy over. And so that's a slider that's in here that we can manipulate and work with. Right now it's set at 90%, assuming that's the base. But as that slider goes up to 92 or 95 or 98, the amount of electricity actually goes up because that means that most of the gas energy is being converted into heat. Hope that helps.
And just on that one, and that is a good note that, again, David's model is looking at the gas energy input. It's not necessarily the gas heat output, right? Because we have no idea what that is. We don't know what our individual customer furnace efficiencies are. And that's why he's saying that, yes, we do need to make an assumption. We have recently got approval now to install automated metering, though, at all of our gas customers. So we're going to be going around to all 1.1 million customers, removing your meter, putting in a new one with an electronic meter. It uses ultrasonic technology to measure the gas flow and communicate that information back to FortisBC. That will be able to give us now a much better insight because we'll be able to see on a customer by customer basis, hour by hour, how you're using gas. And from that, we'll be able to better determine the efficiency of your appliances downstream and better improve our modeling as well. Any other
questions? Mostly
I see comments. Yeah, and they're definitely relevant and good comments. I think that addresses all of them. I guess, yeah, the last one's an interesting question. Do you have resources to assist local government who that are drafting building codes to accommodate the hybrid model? I don't know that we specifically have resources. Obviously, we have a government relations group and we do work with the government routinely. to communicate this information as best we can. But ultimately, it's up to the government and the policymakers to accept that information and use it as they're drafting new codes and standards. So the best we can do is just to share the information and hope that it's used in practicable and realistic solutions.
It might be worth mentioning that there are jurisdictions in the states where the state government has passed legislation called a ban on bans, which means the state government bans municipalities from banning gas. So it's kind of an interesting thing, but certainly varies by region.
I think that covers everything then. All right.
You guys have, oh, you got more?
Nope.
We're at 1:58, David and Paul.
Oh, actually, no, there's okay, we got 2 minutes left. There's one last comment. Maybe that is an interesting one. If using a hybrid system, is the government going to mandate what temperature will need to be set at? Excellent question, because that goes back to David's demonstration here of how, depending on which levers you pull, you might want to actually adjust that transition point. And so, for example, my furnace system, I do have a hybrid, actually. I have a furnace and a heat pump that goes along with it. And it is capable of communicating with the utility. So you can imagine a future where the utility actually almost in real time, based on what is the most cost effective and what's the least emitting scenario to operate in right now. Okay, we'll actually say today in this area of the province, no, all the heat pumps shut down at -5, but in this area, maybe they shut down at -8. And you could have a system that actually calculates that in real time. So just something to consider for the future. And with that, I'll be quiet. Go ahead, Terry.
Never. That was great. That was really good input. Thank you, Alan, for some great questions there. Yes, it is 1:59. As we wrap up, let everybody get on with their day. I just want to thank you both, David and Paul, for taking your time and sharing some information, giving us some more food for thought. And yeah, it's a big conversation. Remind everybody here, there'll be a follow-up email as proof of your 1CPD. And I'm not sure, David and Paul, there's been arrangements to share your information for folks in case they wish to reach out to you. What are the next steps for you two?
So certainly, I think we're both open to email. If you have any questions or whatever, feel free to reach out to us if you want to discuss further. And Alex, I'd kind of defer to you. I believe we have provided the slides in the past to the CHBA for distribution. So
yeah, I'll confirm on that. Okay, thank you so much, you guys. Great job.
thank you
Great,
very
thanks,
much for
folks.
joining us.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.